Alright guys, my name is Metagoblin and today I'm going to be helping you decide which race should you play for Classic World of Warcraft. So I'm going to make two videos on this topic. The first video, which is the one you're watching now, is going to be the more nerdy video, which is going to evaluate every single racial for every single race in the game and kind of discuss the advantages and disadvantages of each racial, and then I'll further discuss my personal recommendations for which is the best race for any given role. For instance, the best race for PvP, the best race for tanking, or the best race for melee DPS, and so on and so forth. My second video will be more of a flavourful RPG style of video, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the background lore of every single race, all the meanwhile showing you the casting animations, melee animations, and all the animations, and what the races look in tier sets and gear sets and all that kind of thing, so you can get a look at what your race is actually going to look and feel like. Anyway, that video will come out later. Today we're looking at racials, and we are going to begin with human. I'm really miffed because just when I turned off recording the video I got the Rallying Cry of a Dragon Slayer buff and it looked absolutely awesome. But anyway, let's move on. So the first big strong racial for humans is going to be mace and sword specialization. The reason why enhancing your weapon skill is useful is because of a hidden mechanic in the game. It's called glancing blows. It's very straightforward. Basically, whenever you hit a boss, you have a chance for your hits to do less damage. So when you enhance your weapon skill beyond the cap, which is 300, you reduce the chance of glancing blows happening. It basically means it's a flat out damage increase, and it's actually one of the strongest abilities in the game, because, well, strongest stats in the game when it comes to increasing your weapon DPS. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to get to a cap. I think the cap is like 15, so 315. You can do this with items, and obviously you can do it with the racials, which bump you up to that cap faster. And it's basically just a very strong flat out damage increase, and it's very useful. Most of the best weapons in the game are going to be swords. This mostly applies to Fury Warriors and Rogues, right, because they're going to be dual wielding with swords most of the time. So that's why human, in my opinion, becomes the strongest melee DPS option on the Alliance side. The next racial is the human spirit. Increases your spirit by 5%. A lot of people diss this talent because, well, the stat increase is, it's quite a marginal advantage. It's only really useful for classes that use spirit a lot, and the only class that really uses spirit massively is the priest, because they can benefit from their spirit stat while in combat. And to be honest, it is good for the priest because it scales very well. Spirit is an interesting stat. It doesn't just give you a flat, MP5 increase whenever you increase the stat. It's going to be further magnified on a very steep correlation curve. So the more spirit you stack, the more effective it becomes. It's very straightforward. So with the extra 5% spirit, your spirit will scale better, slightly better anyway. So you probably will notice a little bit of extra mana regen when playing a human priest, but the thing is, the most of the time people are going to play dwarf priest because of the dwarf priest racial, which is generally considered to be stronger. So moving on, we have I'll talk about perception first actually. So perception is pretty useful in PvP, to be fair. Basically, stealth mechanic is interesting. I think there's like 5 levels of stealth, and your rogues can increase their stealth by talents and increasing the ranks of stealth. Basically, and it reduces the space that the rogue is going to be from the player before he gets detected, or even an NPC in the game. So perception basically increases your stealth level. So it's basically like the rogue will be using a lower rank of stealth when he's near you and trying to creep you and trying to gank you, so it can be fairly useful in PvP. The last talent here is diplomacy. Very straightforward. You gain reputation a little bit faster. If you calculate it out, you will have to get 4,200 less rep to farm a reputation to exalted. So there's a lot of good reputations that you want to grind up in vanilla, particularly Zandalari tribe rep, because of all these enchants. Unfortunately, I can't show you the enchants for some reason on Atlas loot. They're apparently an unsafe item, don't know what that means. But yeah, there's a lot of enchants here which are particularly useful for raiding, and they're pretty much mandatory for you to get. There's also some class sets that you can get as well, which are fairly useful. They're not best in slot, but they're alright. Anyway, moving on. So now we're moving on to the Dwarf. The best and most significant racial for the Dwarf is going to be Stoneform. So Stoneform is a ridiculously underrated and overpowered racial in vanilla World of Warcraft. First of all, it's an extremely good counter in a number of PvP situations, particularly countering a rogue, because a lot of rogue effects like their slow effect, their stun effects are like considered poison effects, so you can basically break out of all of those effects, which it just makes countering a rogue much easier. I would consider this to be an extremely strong tanking racial as well, because there are some extremely nasty poison and disease and bleed effects, right, from boss mechanics, which are literally like raid wiping mechanics if they're not dealt with properly. But when you have Stoneform, you can just kind of pop them off. You make yourself immune to them for 8 seconds, so that can basically really smooth out damage in a fight, particularly as it increases your armor by a further 10%, and if you're stacking armor pretty high as a tank, that 10% is going to be quite significant. It's going to be significant damage reduction, so it really does smooth out damage and save your life in a number of situations, and also extremely strong in PvP for every single class. I think if you're going to be quite serious about doing PvP on the Alliance side, I think Dwarf is going to be one of the best options, if not the best option, arguably. Next we have the Find Treasure racial, which is really underrated. There are some like chests in dungeons which are like kind of round the corner and hidden, and when you have a dwarf in the group, well, a smart dwarf who actually bothers to use his racial, he's going to be the guy, well, you're going to be the guy who finds those extra treasure chests in dungeon runs. And obviously you're going to find them out in the world as well, and obviously chests have a very high chance to drop good green gear, which can be very useful, obviously, for when you're leveling up. And when you don't need it, normally the loot in chest is quite good, and it's just a good burst of money. So yeah, very useful racial. You also have Frost Presence, which only really sees any use in fights like Saffron in Naxxramas, very niche bosses where this becomes useful, and you're going to be stacking frost resistance gear anyway, so the fact that you have frost resistance increased by 10 is just marginally useful. We also have gun specialization. Glancing Blows kind of works a little bit different for hunters. This is only a very marginally useful racial, really. There are a number of situations where you can get a really good gun in the game, but most of the time they are crossbows and bows, which are going to be the best in slot range weapons. You can obviously get the PvP weapons, but it's like Grand Marshal weapons are not exactly an easy. It's not exactly an easy task, is it? So yeah, it's difficult because there's just not many of that good guns in the game. So this racial doesn't really shine that much. And that's all the racials for Dwarf. So let's move on. So let's go through the Gnome. The first big racial for the Gnome is the Expansive Mind racial, which basically increases your intelligence by 5%. The first reason why this is useful is because it marginally increases your mana pool. So, which is, in vanilla, basically, the classes don't really have many ways to regenerate mana with their stats. They have spells and abilities that regenerate their mana, but the mana you have is, it's there, and you need to kind of maintain that mana throughout the entire fight. It's called fight stamina or mana stamina, and basically having a little bit of an extra mana pool is just useful for that. And obviously when you increase your intelligence stat, you also increase the crit chance of all your spells as well. So yeah, again, that is just marginally useful. It's just basically a flat out sustainability increase and a DPS increase. And obviously as you get better and better gear, the 5% becomes more and more significant, and it scales with the more intellect you get. So the more gear you get, the more powerful this racial becomes. Next we have the Escape Artist, which is a very useful root or snare breaker. Basically, it's going to be more of a PvP talent, obviously, but the thing that's very useful about it is it's very short cooldown. I think the cooldown is later increased as more expansions come out. So you've got a short 1 minute cooldown. Very useful spell to get out of snares and stuff like that. But it basically makes Gnome I would say the second best PvP choice next to Dwarf. Some people may argue, fair enough, that the Gnome is actually better. And obviously not every single race that can be a dwarf every single class that can be a dwarf can also be a Gnome, so really it's up to you. I think it's one of the stronger PvP talents out there. The only disadvantage of playing a Gnome, though, if you're playing a melee class, It's basically a hidden racial, which I should have mentioned when I talked about dwarves as well. But basically you have a shorter weapon reach because of your height, and then characters with a who are taller have a higher weapon reach. So that is just something to bear in mind. The next racial we have is engineering specialization. So engineering has a number of summonal temporary pets, which are normally in the form of trinkets. And basically when you increase your engineering skill further than 300, then the granted level of your summoned pet is higher than 60, so you can get a level 63, well, robot chicken, which is, it's fairly useful. It just basically means that if you're going to go engineering, which most people should in vanilla because it's probably the strongest profession out there, your summoned pets are just going to have slightly better stats, therefore more DPS. So this is definitely the strongest casted DPS option, because you've got expansive mind increasing your spell DPS, and then you've got the engineering specialization increasing your DPS even further with your summoned pets. So yeah, pretty cool. The last racial you have is arcane resistance. Has very marginal usefulness. Basically, you have a very small chance to resist arcane abilities, which is stuff like polymorph, and that's about it. So let's go through the Night Elf now. I mean, the Night Elf, in all honesty, probably have the least useful racials out of any other race on the Alliance side. Maybe even the entire game, to be honest. But nonetheless, we'll talk through them. First one is Shadow Meld. The first usefulness of Shadow Meld is, for a non-stealth class, it can be quite useful. I used to do this, when I used to play Rate of Battlegrounds very seriously during the Mrs. Pandaria time. I used to play a Night Elf Death Knight, and what I'll do is if I'm doing Rate of Battlegrounds, I would wait at a base basically in Shadow Meld, and people would just presume that the base is undefended and probably go and attack it, but they wouldn't be undefended obviously, and you can basically get a good ambush on someone. So yeah, it's very useful for defending bases in PvP, and just very good at just surprising someone. It's also you should check out my hunter videos. I found a very useful way to use Shadow Meld as a hunter to basically totally confuse people with a Feign Death Shadow Meld combination, so it's very, very, very useful in PvP situations. If you also look at it very closely, rogues and druid with Shadow Meld are more difficult to detect while stealthed or prowling. So basically it is more... People don't really acknowledge the full usefulness of Shadow Meld to a stealth class, because you just think that, well, rogue and druid have stealth, so they don't really need Shadow Meld. But what Shadow Meld does is it makes their stealth more effective. We briefly talked earlier about how there's stealth levels. I think there's about 5 stealth levels, and obviously increasing your stealth rank increases the levels of that stealth. If you look here, actually, I'm on a rogue right now. If you look at the subtlety tree, I think it's Master of Deception. Yeah, so Master of Deception basically increases your stealth rank even more, and Shadow Meld increases it even more. So it basically means you can get closer to enemies, whether they're NPC or a player, without being detected. So you can get closer, and it's basically easier for you to get an opener and basically not be detected in a PvP ganking situation. So yeah, quite still useful for stealth classes. The next racial is quickness. It's marginally useful for tank classes, but like I've discussed, there is better tank racials for tanks. I think Dwarf is probably a much stronger option than playing a Night Elf, and obviously you've got Human for increased weapon skill and increased damage, which means increased threat generation, but you've got the 1% dodge chance, fairly useful. Also quite useful for rogues at stacking up your avoidance. At the moment I've got 31% dodge chance as a rogue, so that is quite useful. But again, it's only 1%, so it's not massively significant. You also have nature resistance, again marginally useful in fights like AQ and Zul'Gurub, but if you need nature resistance, you're probably just going to stack nature resistance gear anyway. You've also got Wisp Spirit, which is a minor convenience thing. Basically you just run to your corpse faster because you're a wisp, and yeah, it's marginally useful, but yeah, most of the racials are just fairly meh, they're not extremely useful compared to the other races. So let's move on to Orc now. The first racial we have is Blood Fury. This is probably the strongest melee DPS racial in the game. Basically Orc always will be the strongest melee DPS for vanilla, so your Fury Warrior and your Rogue should go Orc to maximise their DPS. The Blood Fury, obviously it's a powerful raid DPS cooldown, but if you're using it as a Rogue, it really gives you a good edge when you're trying to, totally one-shot someone from a ganking situation where you're trying to kill someone within your stuns. Blood Fury is going to make that even more possible. So yeah, just a very, very strong offensive cooldown. Obviously, be careful and mindful of it, as it does reduce the healing you take by 50%. So avoid using it as a tank or if you're in a tight situation. From here, I think the next strongest one is going to be Hardiness. Chance to resist stun effects is increased by an additional 25%. This is quite ridiculous. If you watched any of the duel tournaments during the Classic WoW beta, this was a really useful racial when it came to dueling. So it's just, I think, very useful for PvP situations, particularly as a lot of the stuns in the game, they either have very long cooldowns, they're not spammable crowd control, apart from for Rogue they have shorter cooldowns. And then sometimes even for the priest, they've got blackout stun, which has a very low chance to actually occur in the first place. So resisting a stun can really give you a physical edge in a 1v1 situation, and it might just totally ruin a rogue's opener on you as well. So it is largely considered for that Orca one of the strongest PvP specs races in the game, particularly for warrior and and rogue and stuff like that. So the next one we have is Command, increases your pet damage by 5%. This is very marginal because, well, first of all, the best in slot race for Hunter is actually Troll. So this DPS increase, this DPS increase has never been anything to really acknowledge. It's not particularly significant. It's a very small damage increase. I mean, it's going to be marginally useful for a Warlock if you're a Warlock, like for instance my Warlock now, and you're going to be using the Imp for the sake of getting the Blood Pact buff on the tank group. So which means you're going to be required to have your pet out, and you're going to be required to get a Black Book from the first boss in Blackwing Lair to increase your pet damage even further. But yeah, again, it's very niche, has a very niche value, but whatever. And you also have X specialization, which is obviously useful for similar reasons, but the Mace and Sword specialization are useful for the human. Reduces the chance for you to get glancing blows, and it's just a very flat out DPS increase. Unfortunately, there aren't many best in slot axes. You're going to see less viable axes, but nonetheless there are viable axes out there, so it is quite useful racial. So now let's move on to the Undead. And by the way, I have put this character in Paladin gear on purpose to make it cringe. But anyway, the first strong racial for the Forsaken is the Will of the Forsaken. And basically it's a very simple CC break. It's the reason why Undead I consider one of the strongest PvP options for the Horde, because Fear is a ridiculously strong crowd control effect, and being able to break it and being immune to it for a small duration, which is 5 seconds, is a really good way to counter a Warlock. It's also ridiculously useful in a number of PvE situations, because there are some nasty fear effects in vanilla raid mechanics, so another thing to bear in mind. From here you have underwater breathing, ridiculously useful when you're questing underwater. There's a few quests that you have to do underwater, and they're so difficult to do because you can only really go underwater to kill one mob and before you have to go back to the top. So 3 times the duration underwater is extremely useful. So for open world situations. From here you also have shadow resistance, marginally useful. Maybe in Naxxramas bosses will start to do shadow damage. You will see shadow damage in PvP, but again these resistance racials are normally fairly useless. If it was fire resistance, if any of these races had a fire resistance racial, then it would be quite useful, but I don't think any of them do. From here you also have Cannibalize. Again, it's like one of those open world racials which are useful when you're out questing. You can basically start eating undead or humanoid corpses. So it is really useful when you're leveling as a warrior, for instance, or a rogue, when you have very low sustainability when it comes to regenerating your health. So, which is another reason why there are so many undead rogues out there. But anyway, that is the undead. Let's move on. So let's move on to the Troll. The first significant racial for the Troll is Berserking. Basically increases your casting speed and your attack speed by 10 to 30% depending on what health you are. I think the benefit from the maximum effect of this racial is to get to 40% health. So this is mainly a good racial for casters, as the Orc racial does take over marginally for melee DPS, which is why they're best. Orc is best for racial. Orc is the best for melee DPS, but Troll is the best for casting DPS and also the Hunter. So yeah, basically it's just it's also really useful for healers as well if you need to get cast out particularly fast, but most of all it is basically a caster DPS cooldown, and it's very useful at increasing your DPS. From here you've also got bow specialization. You know, we've already talked about glancing blows and how this is useful for hunters. It's basically the reason why Troll is the best in slot race for hunters, probably in the out of all the races in the game. We've also got regeneration, which is a very insignificant racial. I can only really see this being useful on a class that is already stacking spirit really high. So for instance, if you're leveling a warrior, you might be considering to stack spirit, or leveling a priest, which obviously you stack spirit on as well, and you might, it might just help out with that marginally. But I've basically, people have calculated that this is a very marginally useful racial. We've also got Beast Lane, which is increasing your damage against beasts by 5%. And many raid bosses which, are beasts, and I think a lot of them, I think some of the bosses which are, considered beast, or people think they're beast, aren't actually beast as well. So, but there are obviously beasts in the open world, so this is a marginal DPS increase. And, for Hunter and I think Rogue, they have talents which increase their DPS to certain enemy types as well, so this 5% stacked onto those talents is quite significant. So I can see this becoming useful if you're farming a particular beast to make money. You'd be doing a little bit of extra damage and saving yourself a little bit of extra time, but that's about it. It is a fairly marginal racial, as well as this throwing specialization. So obviously throwing weapons, you never really use throwing weapons as a viable DPS option. You use it in very rare situations in PvP if you're snared, and warriors only really use throwing weapons to pull enemies, and that's about it. So yeah. Now we're moving on to the Tauren, the first racial that people generally talk about a lot, and they rave about how useful it is endurance. The usefulness of a talent, it's all right, but it's not it's not incredible. Basically, increase your total health by 5%, which is the reason why this talent is fairly good. Obviously, it's good for tanks for just getting that health pool a little bit higher, which could be the difference between getting killed or not. But it's very difficult to calculate, when that does actually happen. But the reason why it is kind of useful is because as you increase your health pool further and further, basically this talent this racial is going to scale even more. So the more gear you get, the more effective this racial becomes. So yeah, marginally useful for tanks, and that's about it. You will notice a difference obviously in PvP gear as well. But I think the stronger racial for Tauren is going to be Warstorm, particularly as a tank, because you can make some seriously good clutch plays if you can just totally negate damage on you for 2 seconds because you stun all enemies near you. This can be used to save your life in a number of situations, if you've overpulled or something like that. And obviously it's very useful for PvP to give a little extra cheeky stun to interrupt a cast or something like that, or just to get a bit of a distance on people. Another thing I briefly mentioned about Tauren, I mentioned it before, basically because you're taller as a Tauren, it's kind of like you have a hidden racial that your weapon reaches further than the other races because you're taller. So yeah, that's just another thing to quickly bear in mind. What other racials do we have? Obviously we have nature resistance, like we said with the Night Elf, marginally useful. It would only really be useful if it's fire resistance, because you do take a lot of fire damage in raiding environments in vanilla, but again it sees very little use. And then the only good one here, the only other one is cultivation, which increases your herbalism skill. I haven't heard of this being particularly useful. I haven't heard of any herb being out there in the game which requires you to have a herbalism skill over 300. So yeah, I don't really see this being a particularly interesting racial, to be honest, other than the fact that you're going to be able to farm Mage Royale faster than the other races on launch. But so for my my personal recommendation for melee DPS for the Alliance side, if you're going to minimax absolutely everything and you're going to go hardcore, you want the best gameplay possible and to be most effective in your gameplay, then I go for human for melee DPS, and I go for orc on the horde side. For casters, I'd recommend going gnome or troll. And then for a tank, I would recommend going Dwarf or Tauren. But Troll is also a very good option for threat generation. Human is also a very good option for threat generation, but purely for defensive purposes, you know, it's definitely Troll and Dwarf. Then for healer, it doesn't really, well, I suppose it does matter on the alliance side. I would say that, I mean, it doesn't, yeah, it's one of those ones, obviously when it comes to priest, priest is its own different topic, which, you know, requires its own video because there's so many different racials for priest. But, you know, it really never really matters. I would say Troll is marginally better for the increased cast time. You know, you can use that quite effectively in a clutch play to get some fast heals off, and it'd probably be quite useful in a PvP situation because obviously your health is going to be reduced in a PvP situation, so you might be able to get extremely fast heals off if you use Berserking at the correct time. So I can see Troll being marginally better for healing on the Horde side, but on the Alliance side, you've obviously got Dwarf, Priest being generally considered the best option because of Fear Ward. But you know, when it comes to Paladin, I don't think it really matters which option you go for. I guess, I mean, the Human is slightly better for the Spirit increase, but then again, Stoneform is so ridiculously useful as well, so really, it is up to you. And then obviously for Hunter, which is obviously the ranged physical damage DPS, on the Alliance side, I've calculated this and it really doesn't matter. Technically, Night Elf will do very marginally more damage because they have slightly higher agility stat than Dwarf, but it's fairly insignificant. I think it's only about 10 agility, so depends how you want to judge that really. And on the Horde side, it's definitely going to be Troll because you've got, the DPS increase of bow skill, and you've got Berserking, which stacks ridiculously well with improved aspect of a Hawk Talent and Rapid Fire. So if you stack all them together and you start doing really, really fast aim shots, it's a massive DPS increase if used properly and timed correctly. Anyway, I am finally going to end the video there. My name is Metagoblin. Until my next video, ciao.